This is the BEnergyAware Podcast. Hi, and welcome to the BEnergyAware Podcast. This episode, as usual, is brought to you by Get Empowered audiobook. You can find the link to this audiobook in the description of this episode. My guest today is William Allen, a highly sensitive man and the author of the book Confessions of a Sensitive Man: An Unconventional Defense of Sensitive Men. William and I talk about the role of highly sensitive people in today's world and how we can all contribute to making this world a better place, while at the same time being authentic and true to ourselves. To me, when someone says highly sensitive, what comes first is highly sensing. And I know it firsthand. So this is how I see myself in the world. Wherever I go, whatever I do, it's just this: I cannot miss things. I cannot not see things. I cannot not feel things. And I, of course, like I may be a highly functioning, highly sensitive person. And it's that sensitivity and that sensing things that we're kind of, some people would consider us super talented geniuses and whatnot, but to me it's just this, it's just the way I am. It was just a part of me, and the way I was seeing the world, the way I was just needing to be in the world with what I could feel and I could see, and how I could relate to things and how I could do things. Because as soon as I would do something that would be the way someone else would do it, it didn't work.
Yeah.
It never ever worked.
Well, that's kind of how talent is. I mean, we consider it a gift. I do anyway. And I think a lot of other people do as well. Um, when you have a gift, it's so natural, it's so easy for you that you almost fail to see that it's a gift, right? If you're, say, for example, like yourself, a talented musician, it may, for somebody who's not a musician, and to see you be able to put music together and interpret feelings and emotion with music, they think, wow, that's an amazing thing. But for you, you see yourself doing it because it's natural for you. It's easy for you to do. And I think that's what happens for a lot of people who have talents, is they don't fully understand, or they may, but they just sort of take it for granted that they can do this thing and other people can't. And so those things that you see, and like you say, you kind of nuance things from the environment. You can't unsee them, unhear them, untaste or smell or anything else. Those are things that just come naturally to you. And it's easy for you to do those things. And for other people, they may miss that, because they don't have that ability. And I think highly sensitive people have that. And we're not all exactly the same. We all don't have exactly the same talents, and our personalities aren't exactly the same, but we all bring to the table something unique that is filtered through that highly sensitive perspective that we have. And that, I think, adds depth and dimension to whatever talent we have, whether it's writing or music, or whether you're just somebody who is a talented mathematician or whatever. You see things, feel things, sense things that other people miss. And that's one of the reasons why I think we have a gift, and we're kind of special. And one of the reasons why I think we can be a positive influence in the world, because we do see those things.
So how to be this positive influence in the world? How do we go about doing that?
Well, I think first of all, there are a lot of people out there that don't even know they're sensitive. They've got these traits, they've got this ability to sense things, but they don't exactly know what it is. They can't put it all together. And there's good and bad with being sensitive. You have some things about the trait that, if it's not managed correctly, you can be overwhelmed with things, and it can be seen to be a negative thing, but it's not if you know how to manage them. first of all, I think highly sensitive people need to embrace the trait. And first of all, they have to know what it is. So that's part of our job, the people who do know about it, is to go out and talk about it to people, family, friends, coworkers, wherever your sphere of influence is. Make sure that you let people know about that, and especially about the fact that you have the trait. And a lot of times you'll find people that you know who don't know they have it, and they'll automatically want to know more about it. So what you've done is you spread information about the trait so they understand it as well. Once we understand and embrace the trait, I think there's lots of outlets we can do. And I think we should take it as a responsibility to educate other people. Now, some people are going to feel more comfortable getting up in front of a larger group of people, maybe a wider audience, and doing that. Other people are going to be more comfortable if it's a smaller group. Every one of us will be contributing something to that. And I think in doing that and in enlightening the world about high sensitivity, there's going to be some residual effects that might be positive for other people. Let me give you an example. Let's say it's a workplace situation. You've got a work environment that you're really uncomfortable with. Maybe there's something excessively noisy, or maybe it's too busy because the cubicle walls aren't high enough, or something like that, or the heat is too much, or it's just environmental things. Well, as an HSP, and if you explain that to people and let them know that you're sensing these things and feeling these things, maybe you're picking up this sort of negative environmental situation at your work, and you become the canary in the coal mine. Maybe other people are feeling it too, but they just don't sense it like you do. It's there and it's affecting them, but you're the one who's really the one picking it up. So that's an example of where you can make a positive change in the work environment if you can start bringing this to attention of management or HR or anybody else in your corporate world or small company world, wherever it may be. You can actually start creating the change that may be necessary to make the environment positive for everybody else. Now, I write in the book a little bit about that, and I talk about the fact that corporations aren't going to bend over backwards necessarily because you want to have a certain type of light in your cubicle or whatever. But the idea is that you can affect change by bringing awareness to people about the things that you're sensing and seeing. And if what Dr. Aaron is saying is that we are, sort of the cautionary counseling type individuals that the world needs, you can't do that job if you're quiet all the time. You don't say anything about it. You've got to bring that awareness up. So if you are aware of something, there's a very good chance that there are other people that are also aware of it too, but maybe at a more subtle level than you have been aware of it. So there are lots of ways. I'm just using that as an example. You could do that in whatever grouping that you may find you're in your community. We need to start standing up and doing more things like that. And it's going to take a little bit of courage from us because we're naturally not necessarily the ones that are out in front center. But I think people listen to what we say when we speak authentically. And when we do that, they listen because they know what we're saying is true at some level. And they may not embrace everything we say. I'm not being naive here, but the idea is that chances are pretty good that if you're sensing it as an HSP, that it's probably flying under the radar of most people. And if it's something that you're having negative result from, whatever, and in outcome from that, it's likely other people are like that too. And so the spread and depth of that is great. I just, like I said, I think we're just now beginning as a group to start to realize what our abilities are. You can see this on Facebook groups or places where people gather online to talk about the trait. That people are kind of stepping out on a shaky ground for them. They're stepping out and they're saying, "Do you feel this way, or does this bother you too?" And they're getting feedback, and they're realizing, it's not some kind of disorder on their part, but actually other people feel that and sense that as well. And I really believe that has function. It's not just something that's for you and sort of in your smaller world, but it's something that can be shared with the greater world. And I really do believe HSPs have that function, and I think that's really one of the main reasons that we need to talk more about it. We can affect a positive change in the world. I do believe that.
Yeah. And times are changing. The world is changing. People are changing. So to me right now, this doesn't seem that much just a highly sensitive person or people thing. It's affecting everyone, what the changes in the world right now. And
Correct.
to me, just this highly sensitive perspective, it just makes more sense today than ever before. And it's just, to me, it's just common sense. So I feel and believe that a lot more people will start to see things slightly more, at least slightly more, as we are seeing them.
Yes.
Something along those lines. And what we are saying as highly sensitive people, and what we are expressing and pointing out to the world to see more clearly, is not going to be that big of a deal anymore, in terms of not. I think it's going to be a little bit better received.
I agree with you too. I really think we're at a critical point in the history of human civilization. We've got so many issues that are pressing on us now. Some of them are monumental, things like climate change, right? Um, uh, uh, and people are asking for recognition, acknowledgement, equality. These are things that have been denied many people in our culture for a long, long time. And I think there's issues about economics, about how much wealth is being concentrated at the top, and very few people are being prosperous. Um, One of the things that I thought, especially on an economic note, there, I read somewhere, and it's actually, I think, by a Canadian author. It was read several years ago. I wish I could remember his name, and I wish I could remember the book. Maybe one of your subscribers will know it. But he wrote about a happiness quotient. We spend so much time worrying about the gross domestic product and how that measures up in dollars and cents and whether we're successful or not. But the one thing we miss is happiness, right? This happiness quotient. And there's a few countries in the world, most of them are small, who measure success from the government's perspective and how much the happiness quotient is. And one of the richest countries in the world, of course, is the United States, but we don't measure very highly against happiness. You have other countries, perhaps Canada, perhaps the Scandinavian countries, that tend to typically fall higher in that ratio. And yet they have a completely different kind of viewpoint about how distribution of wealth is and so forth. I think that's something that would really touch the hearts of most HSPs. Most HSPs would understand that at some level, because environment for us is so important. Happiness is so important for us. Being in a state of balance is important for us. And that's something that HSPs could become thought leaders on, to maybe promote that idea of happiness over just gross domestic product and just sheer accumulation of wealth and money. There's always some kind of price to pay for that kind of mentality, but trying to find those places where we can spread this idea of let's try to work towards a world where people are more happy, they're more satisfied, they're more fulfilled, and they're whatever. And I know HSPs are kind of idealistic people, I think, at their core, which I think is a good thing. Um, and I think we could embrace things like that. So, I mean, it's another idea that could be taken forward, and HSPs could help promote and champion those kind of concepts and ideas.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it just reminded me again about, again, the same thing that, my observation, at least in the last 10 years, that I've really zoomed on to people around me. And what I've been noticing is how, if they're not true to themselves, and their values are not aligned with their core values, and how they live in the world and what they do and how they do things, their lives don't work. And so, with this big change in the world, people have had a lot of time to think about things and how they
Yes.
want to live, and they can clearly see what didn't work. And now, with this having this space and time, I'm just wondering how many of those people, highly sensitive and not highly sensitive, are going to choose to do things differently to actually be fulfilled, to actually be happy, and just simply for their lives to work.
You know, what I said a lot about in the book is that, especially for HSP men, is that we can be models, role models, or we could model a certain type of behavior. And it doesn't have to be on a grand level, but it could be on your everyday level. Because I believe that HSPs need to be in a kind of a balanced, harmonious environment. The emphasis for us very often is the environmentals. It's what's around us, who we work with, what kind of things we're doing. Are we being authentic? Are we doing things that are true to us? Is there internal conflict and stress because we're not doing those things? And I think if we can, as a group, can start saying to our, especially our younger HSPs, yes, this is what you should be pursuing those things that are authentic to you, that are true to you, and worry less about how much money you're going to make, and focus more about, the kind of happiness you're going to have within yourself and you're going to be able to give to other people. They in turn can grow up to learn to model this behavior to other people who are not getting that. So I really think that modeling behavior is a very powerful way of being able to show other people the success you're having, and on those terms, happiness and inner peace and harmony. And they will be drawn to that and will want to know more about how to do that. So again, this is where we can be thought leaders, because I worked in a corporate environment for 30 something years, and it was not a natural fit for me. It was not the natural place for me to be in. I made the best of it. I did fairly well in it in terms of material success, but inside I wasn't happy. And uh, I look back on my life now and think, wow, if I could have heard this message when I was younger, I might have chosen a different career path, one that would have made me happy. And ultimately, because I was being authentic and genuine with myself, I might have been able to been financially successful with that, simply because I was good and authentic at what I did, and that would have drawn people to me and so forth. But again, the end result is not the material side of it, it's the internals, right? And that's the thing that HSPs live and die with, is those internal components that we need to satisfy. It almost has a religious, spiritual tone to it. But I think that's why HSPs are so drawn to religious and spiritual things, or things that are non-material. Um, Maybe we see through the BS. I don't know, or maybe it's just our internal workings that have to have that.
Well, to this day, I still am not able to put a finger on it, as in, I cannot define it or explain it in words. It was always this feeling inside of me that I had for what was right for me and what wasn't right for me. And for the most part in my life, I managed to stick to that. As young as I was, I would rather uh, literally make enemies than do what I didn't feel like doing. And I was very clear about that. And so, everyone has choices. And I guess for myself, I was lucky to be at such a young age to made that I have made such grown up choices in a way. And although I wasn't quite aware of this highly sensitive trait,
Mhm.
I had a good sense about how different I was from very early on from elementary school. And you talk about that in your book. You're describing what you went through as a little boy, and then through your teenage years and so on. And you really this these are the parts of your book that really touch me the most. You sharing your personal experiences. And I think that's the biggest thing for me about your book, is that if some younger man or a boy or a teenager reads that, or just hears about something like that, or their mom reads that, or their dad reads that, and starts talking about it, I think that might make a big difference for them.
Oh, absolutely. You know, my parents were both HSPs. My mother's still alive. My dad passed away when I was 17, but he was an HSP too. And but there was no definition for the characteristic at the time. That wasn't going to come for, oh gosh, 20 something years later, after my dad passed. He never knew. But for him particularly, because where the part of the United States he grew up in and I grew up in, it was not traditional for a man to express sensitivity and so forth. So having a son that was like that, and even like him, uh, was kind of in his mind, he was trying to do everything he could to steer me away from that. He was trying to mold me into what a young man was supposed to be like, or a traditional male was supposed to be like. Now, to your point, if I had learned about this earlier on and my parents had been kind of understanding of what sensitivity was, they would have understood themselves a lot better, but they certainly would have understood how to raise me in a different way. Now, I am not complaining about the way they raised me. I had very decent, good, kind parents, but there were things about the sensitivity that nobody got. And encouraging, especially young HSP boys, about pursuing those characteristics, that authenticity that we just talked about in themselves, what they're drawn to, I think builds confidence, because you're saying to them basically, because you want to do this, that's something you should pursue, and that's a good thing, as opposed to, you need to pursue this because you'll never make a living doing that. So those kinds of elements, I think, are really important for raising of especially HSP boys, but certainly HSP girls as well. This is not, necessarily one or the other. But I can talk about being an HSP male and much more authoritatively, I guess, than I could be being an HSP female. But nevertheless, that's really good that you had that inner guidance, like radar, that told you, don't do this, and you acted upon that. If you were being told, this is not inside of you, this is not something I should be doing, and not doing it, you're acting on your intuition, right? And your inner compass. Um, for me, I didn't do that. I acted on what people were telling me what to do. And instead of saying, you know what, I really would rather do this, instead, I went the traditional route. So if there are young HSP boys out there, young HSP men out there who are going through this internal conflict, this is a thing that they need to learn, is that you've got to trust your intuition. You've got to trust your inner compass. You've got to trust what's authentic for you. It might be something that's doable for the other 80% that are not HSPs. They might be able to live with that, get through it. I honestly think it's true for all humans, but especially for HSPs. This is something that we really need to get right, or else we're going to be miserable. And I'm glad to hear that you were following your compass all along.
Well, it was very specific for me. What really happened was what really changed everything for me when I started playing guitar, and that was at the age of 15. So relatively not that early on. Like guitar players start playing at age of 5, 6, and so on, 7, 8, 9, 10. But I had my first encounters with guitars at the age of 11, I think. But then through friends and so on, but not until I was 15 that I got my first guitar. And so because of all the circumstances in my life back then, my parents getting divorced and so on, I needed something. I really
Right.
needed something so bad that I every every moment of my time that I could spare went to the guitar. Day and night and hours, just couldn't get away from guitar. I could say that the guitar saved my life. And so what I'm trying to say with this, so I grabbed onto something and got good at it, and that gave me that initial confidence that I could just I had and I also had something to really fight for. So
Right.
that kind of kept me there to be able to be so strong at that young age and say no, 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 this is not for me, no, thank you, no, I know what I need to do. And so this helped me. It was like I guess I'm lucky in a way. It just happened like that, and I couldn't get away from guitar, and that gave me confidence, and that kind of directed my life towards where I am now. And that's all I can really say about it.
That's a great story. Being able to express yourself, being able to channel your emotions and feelings and so forth through the guitar, which is music is a great way of doing that. It in sticking with it and uh, letting it in many ways lead you to a career was a great intuitive way. It's a very HSP way of finding your place, right? It's it's uh, it's almost like sort of sitting down with yourself and just sort of channeling what it is you needed to get out of that working with the guitar and so forth. And it paid great dividends to you in that it was an emotional release. You were going through a difficult time, and you were able to use that as a way of channeling some of that feeling and so forth into the playing of the guitar. And ultimately, it led you, like we're saying, into your career. That's the kind of intuitive way I think HSP children should be taught to sense what it is they're supposed to do in life. There was something I said in the book. It was about let the little boy, and it could apply to little girl too, let them tell you who they are. Don't tell them who they are. You don't know who they are. And especially if it's an HSP, you really need to let them show you, tell you what it is, where they want to go, what they're good at, what makes them happy. And it's something I think it's critical for HSPs to be successful in life is to be doing something that's meaningful to them, that has an authentic ring to it, so that they know that they're exercising on their core being. And that's really what we need to be bringing up our HSP children to see and do. And hopefully, what happens from that is they grow, they get more confident, they can step out in the world and be who they are, and maybe there's less overwhelm because they're not dealing with these internal conflicts of not doing and being who they're supposed to be.
HSP heroes. We normally recognize them, and so
Yeah.
I think we can talk freely, and not everyone needs to agree with us, but let's name a few.
Well, I called one person out in the book that everybody knows, Robin Williams. And I think what was the dead giveaway for me was he was a comedic genius, but his genius was used, I think, in many ways to mask the inner sensitivity within him. You know, he could be crazy, he could be out there, and he could deflect, uh, you know, any kind of look inside of him. But you could not ignore his dramatic roles that he did in movies because he was brilliant at that. And in fact, I think he was a much more brilliant actor than he was a comedian. And that's a stretch, I think, probably for some people. But you look at some of the roles he played. Goodwill Hunting was a great and wonderful role. Dead Poet Society, and one of the others that I think about is What Dreams May Come, which was a very HSP movie. And I happen to know the guy who produced the movie, Stephen Simon, who is also, I think, an HSP. It's a sort of a very artistic interpretation of what death is like and what experience of death is and so forth. But anyway, he was such a wonderful person, I think, just by looking at this, by his dramatic roles. And he was so much of an HSP, you know. So he comes to mind. He's become kind of my poster child. And I have no way of absolutely knowing, because I don't know if he ever took the test, whether he would acknowledge it if he did have it. But I think, just like you said, because of observation, we can see people that are HSPs, and we've got a radar for that kind of stuff. And we know another fellow HSP when we see one. And
Oh,
I think he was one that really, he is a very charitable, big-hearted guy. He did a lot of charity work, did a lot of work for the troops when they were in Iraq, and probably Afghanistan. Um, so he gave a lot. He had all the markers for an HSP. So I think he's probably one that I kind of hold up as a kind of a poster child for an HSP hero. It's just unfortunate he had such a tragic ending. I think I understand why. I don't think it was a normal sort of suicide kind of thing. I think he was battling with some things that we couldn't understand. I think it was tragic on many levels, but it was unfortunate that we lost him.
yeah.
But I mean, if you look in the world of acting and film, you can find them all over the place. I honestly think that there are a lot of HSP comedians. There are a lot of HSP actors. I think to be able to get inside of a character and be able to express it takes empathy and intuition and a certain knowledge. And you have to have a certain sensitivity to do that. So these are people that we revere, that we hold up. These are HSPs that we hold up and say, look, that person's you're a big fan of them, or you look up to them, or whatever. So definitely in the arts, we have a lot of HSPs, and probably almost too many to name. I wish I had a list in front of me, because I had some list in the book about some of these people that are like that. Once you understand the quality and just start looking around it, you immediately start saying, I bet that person's an HSP, or I bet that person's an HSP, because you see the characteristics that you carry and they're showing them too, even at sometimes a superficial level. But to the idea of heroes, I would like to see more HSP heroes in our books, in our novels, maybe in our songs, in our ways that we communicate and hold, wherever we hold heroes high. HSP should certainly be in there. It should be represented very highly, I think. How do you feel about that?
Well, I admire those that lived in the 20th century and earlier, like Marlon Brando, for example, and how he must have been so misunderstood by
Yes.
the whole movie industry,
Right.
refusing an Academy Award, his interviews as well. It just comes out through everything he did, in real life and in the movies as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And he was a powerful actor. I mean, he totally immersed himself in his characters. So yeah, I think you could probably go through cinematic history and pick out a lot of, especially males who were powerful actors, who were highly sensitive people as well. Uh, you know, Sometimes they had to portray characters that were sort of I wouldn't say anti HSP, but kind of not what we would normally typically sort of characterize as HSPs. But for the most part, it's how they delivered their role, how they delivered the character they were portraying on the film, that really tells you whether or not they're really highly sensitive people or not. And I think one of the things you see, especially in artists, is this depth of dimension that really, and Dr. Aaron talks about one of the things that's characteristic about HSPs is our depth of processing. It's that deep thinking that we do. And I also think it's deep feeling as well. We feel at a very core level of ourselves. And so that makes people who are HSPs that are actors especially suited for doing acting work, that brings out that inner depth that a character needs to have to be more than just two-dimensional kind of stand-up cardboard looking character. They have to give it depth. So that's the kind of stuff that we're good at.
So I'm a musician, so I can name a few musicians and say how I feel about those musicians and the music from my perspective as a highly sensitive person. And so Elvis Presley, Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, Jimi Hendrix. Well, obviously his musical playing. I mean, it's funny because my son immediately, when he was probably 12, 13 years old, started listening to Hendrix, and he just absolutely got into it. I mean, completely immersed himself in Jimi Hendrix and his playing. But I think as a person, he was a very sensitive man. You know, I've seen people, probably seen a few documentaries about him, interviews about people who knew him personally. He seemed like a very soft-spoken, sensitive man. When he got on stage, that was his passion, and he sort of exploded when he got on stage. And the music was an expression of that inner feeling that he had within him. But off stage, I think he was pretty quiet, pretty, reserved person. I could be wrong. I didn't know him, but from what I understand and what portrayal. So that's a good HSP definition, I think, is especially when you've been able to find what it is you're passionate about, you can just kind of let it, take you and go where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I really admired those people because they lived back then, and the world was so different, and I mean, no wonder they were doing all kinds of things and not even being kind to themselves in many ways, and but they were on a mission. And
Truly.
that was clear. That's very clear. They knew there was something out there and they need to follow it. And didn't know they probably didn't know exactly how, but they just knew they need to keep on going and keep on going. And that is a characteristic of a highly sensitive person because you cannot not do what you do and because you're so passionate about it. And nothing really can stop those people. I mean, rarely anything can stop them. So those and yes, it's important to name a few musicians, but there are so many people out there. It's good to make a list at some point and really talk about them because each one of them is a great example of so many things that we could study and look of really good things that we can actually study and take as something that we can use in our own way again in the future or from now on. And so I think it's worth mentioning them. I think it's worth talking about them, and it's worth to me it was always worth studying not only their music but how they lived and the choices they were making. And I didn't always agree with their choices, of course, but
Mhm.
then in the context of those times,
Sure.
wow, they were actually doing really well considering everything and that they were so
Yeah.
highly sensitive at the same time.
There, you can draw that sensitivity if you look at the way they express themselves or how they were recorded, the actions, behaviors that they had, and you can use them as, like you said, living historical examples of high sensitivity, sort of where the rubber meets the road, where they're out there actually living a life. Um, and I think that is a very good point, Bran. I really think that that's something that really needs to be written about, is the idea of taking historical figures and placing them in context of maybe their time, but the fact within context of the sensitivity characteristic, where it kind of shows up in their lives, how it how it defines their lives, and ultimately whatever contribution they had, how that played into their sensitivity. Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Is there any message you would like to give to highly sensitive men out there right now?
Well, someone asked me, let me kind of back up a minute. Someone asked me, what's your favorite chapter in the book, right? And my favorite chapter in the book is the last chapter, which is the shortest chapter by far. And it was a message basically about the journey of being an HSP man or an HSP male. And what I would say to any HSP male is if you're confused or you're not sure about the trait, or even if you feel comfortable embracing the trait, study it, read. Um, there's lots of forums and places you can go to interact with other people. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to embrace it because you won't be happy unless you do. And I will say this, that when you do that, when you do embrace it, it's going to be okay. Everything will be okay. It'll start to fit, it'll start to make sense, and you'll start to see things that you didn't see before about you and about your world. So that last chapter of the book, I think, really sums it up for me about being an HSP man is a good thing. And I really feel like after having written the book, it made me feel more comfortable about it and made me feel like, you know what, from here on, I'm not backing down on this. I'm going to stand up for HSP men and HSPs generally. And I want to promote the trait and make sure that people understand that it's a good thing. And you know what? The funny thing about it is all those years I kept thinking, I want to deny that I'm a sensitive man. The minute I started admitting it, the world just opened up to me. People came up to me and are very open about this. And you'd be surprised how many people want to know about it, even if they're not HSPs. So that's been a real refreshing thing to find out. So for all HSP men, hang in there, keep learning, keep reading, keep embracing who you are, and find your authentic self. That's so important.
Thanks again to William for sharing all that he has shared. And once again, I have to say that I consider William to be a gifted writer. As always, let me know your thoughts. Message me on Instagram at BEnergyAware or through my website, BEnergyAware.com. And if you like this podcast, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or just hit 5 stars. And please share this podcast with your friends. I'm Bran, your host, and I'll talk to you again in the next episode.